Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this second day of the Second Australian Circular Economy Conference. My name is Dianne Wiley. I'm the Head of School of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering at the University of Sydney. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land where I'm speaking to you from, at the confluence of the Bidjigal, Gweagal and Gadigal nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I think this is a wonderful opportunity we have over this week to think about how we can continue a line of discussion that actually started with our Indigenous custodians many years ago. That value that we place on the proper use of resources, and then how we protect those resources for future generations. And so if you think about it, that's exactly what a circular economy is all about. It's about preserving our resources and making the best use of them. It's just over 12 months, it's just over 2 years ago that we held the first Australian Circular Economy Conference up at the Central Coast. And in opening that conference, I reflected on my own experiences when I was growing up and how we really engaged in the circular economy then. We had a really great tradition in our family and with many of our people that we lived around of repairing, reusing and recycling pretty much everything that we used in our everyday lives. And I guess what's been particularly distressing to me over the past decades is that we've really moved away from that. A lot of that has been because of the design of products. They've been made to break almost. And also I notice when I reflect back that my own behaviours, I've moved away from a circular economy as well. And it's been, I guess, a real insight for me over the time of COVID of how much being at home, my partner and myself, we've spent a lot of time on our own house doing exactly that, repairing, recycling, reusing things. And I think that if we think about the purpose of this conference, that's really then what we're all talking about. I think my other reflection would be that if I look at what's happened between the time we held the first Australian conference and this one, there's actually been an amazing uptake, an amazing number of industries that have come forward and have started working in the area of recycling, and that's really terrific. And I think that's also reflected in the fact that our first conference ran for 2 days, and now we have this wonderful 5-day conference of people sharing ideas and projects and things that are happening. It's also a really great pleasure today to be chairing this session that's sponsored by New South Wales Circular, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's Lisa McLean, who is the CEO of New South Wales Circular. And she says in her bio that she sees her role as being a transformation leader for the circular economy and zero carbon businesses. Lisa actually started her career as a political journalist working in the National Press Gallery before she moved on to advising ministers and premiers on education and climate policy, and then heading off to the UK to establish the Clinton Climate Initiative. Over the 14 years of her career, she's covered areas such as energy, water, waste and mobility sectors in the UK and Australia. Lisa established the Open Cities Alliance, a peak industry association with members from government, private sector and research organisations. The Open Cities Alliance advocated for the circular economy, prosumer rights and new local utility and mobility precincts. When Lisa returned to Australia, she initiated the Australian Solar Thermal Association, advised electromobility providers and worked with flow systems to set up a startup sustainable water utility and shaped it into its major role for new sustainable water market and now a multi-utility market. Lisa is going to present to us today on a topic to do with a general overview of policy and innovation roadmap for a circular economy and a little bit of an overview of New South Wales Circular's role. And there may be a bit of time after Lisa's presentation to ask a few questions. So if you have a question as she's presenting, please type it into the Q&A function on the Zoom down the bottom on the right-hand side, and we'll see if Lisa has a bit of time to answer your questions. Over to you, please, Lisa.
Hi, Diane. Thank you so much. And it's fantastic to be here this morning, everyone, to open today's session of this Australian Circular Economy Conference, which we're also supporting. But before we start, I also want to acknowledge the original architects of circular systems, the traditional custodians of the land on which we each live and work as we join this meeting. And for me, this is the Biomolecular clan, and I want to acknowledge and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Indigenous people joining our conference today. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And I also want to give special acknowledgement to Ali Abbas and the team at the University of Sydney who have delivered this exceptional conference with some help from our team, Sally Hill and Laura Carroll. And I'd like to give a shout out to Australia's first circular economist, Dr. Mei Tang, who you're going to hear from after me this morning. So if we move to the next slide, how timely and important this conference is. And Diane, I really agree with your sentiments here. You know, seeing you all here from research, industry, from government and not-for-profit sectors, and hearing incredible circular economy examples and insights and discussions between you all and the expert panels is really exciting. And it does remind me also, as Diane mentioned, just how far we've come in understanding and transitioning to a circular economy. And when I think back over the past decade, it's really inspiring to see the progress, how circular economy is being understood and reflected in economic activity, new businesses, new financial products, new sharing and reuse products and services across water and energy and mobility and beyond just waste management. The other thing that I really think that is exciting to see is that we've really begun to design out waste, so altogether, and we're understanding how to measure the true value of resources and the benefits of keeping resources in the market longer. And over this past decade, there have been several World Circular Economy Forums backed by the World Economic Forum, which has been raising awareness in about 125 countries now about circular economy. And they're engaged in this discussion and they're attending these forums. And we have about 11% of global economic activity that's circular at the moment, and it is growing fast. In Australia, peak organisations for circular economy have hundreds of members. New South Wales Circular alone, for us, we now have 6 task forces that we host with about 200 experts across finance and research, government, infrastructure and services. And everybody's working really hard to remove the barriers in their sectors to transition to a circular economy. So quite a bit of momentum, and of course, there is a way to go yet. But the proof of progress is here with you all and on display over this week as we hear from circular economy pioneers and innovators. And one thing we know is that we cannot scale the circular economy without working together. So I wanted to move on to the next definition around what is circular economy. So, you know, and what is all the fuss about circular economy at the moment? Circular economy offers a systematic response to not just the climate crisis, but the climate, biodiversity and consumption crises. And the circular economy promotes the reuse of raw materials and resources to create a sustainable economy that's free of waste and emissions. It shifts us away from, it's shifting us away from the current linear economic model of take, make and waste to an economy where we design out and avoid, reduce, recycle and reform resources to keep them in the market for longer and longer. And it is based on 3 principles. It's based on design out waste and pollution. It's based on keep products and materials in use. And 3, it's regenerate natural systems. And at New South Wales Circular, what we're really at pains to point out is that the circular economy is the entire economy. It's the new iteration of our economy. And it's being driven not just from the digital transformation, not just from businesses bottom up, but also through policy. And if we look at the next slide, if we look at the fact that by 2050, there will be 10 billion people on the planet and not enough resources to continue consuming at the rate we are today, it's because of our take, make and waste unsustainable approach to natural resource use that we now face the global climate crisis, the consumption crisis and the biodiversity crisis. And these 3 things are connected. And 4 years ago, Finland, in partnership with the World Economic Forum, set up, as I mentioned before, the World Circular Economy Forum to promote circular activity. And we are seeing a huge amount of countries and interest in driving a circular economy. And that's because it's really the only option we have at the moment to grow our economies, create jobs in a resource-constrained future. And it's a big shift. And we all have a role to play in this transition. We need our researchers to be innovating with industry and government to solve the big problems and barriers and challenges right across the economy as we transition away from this throwaway, flush away, carbon intensive economy to a sustainable one. I want to talk now about the economic opportunity. The circular economy is estimated to be about $4.5 trillion in commercial opportunity globally, and it's growing. And as we begin to sort of separate and recycle our materials at scale and value the resource and in them, and to keep them in the market longer, recycling our waste and sharing our mobility, generating our energy locally and even our water locally, and selling, trading the excess, more and more circular businesses and services are starting to appear. And these new sharing and reuse business models like shared mobility and mobility as a service, fashion as a service, white goods as a service, these are transforming markets around the world. And New South Wales is no exception. By 2050, circular economy is estimated to add about 210 billion to Australia's GDP. And we think this is conservative at New South Wales Circular, as 210 billion doesn't include all of the sectoral opportunities that circular economy can offer. So you'll hear from Dr. Mei Tang later, and this is something that New South Wales Circular is wanting to continue our work with you all and with industry to estimate the value of the circular economy in different sectors, and we'll be updating you with our work there. The next thing I want to say is that what do circular economy products and services look like? And I'm talking about shared mobility. Well, mobility is a service. That means that we actually don't need to buy our cars. We can share them. And there's there's really big cost savings for consumers to do it this way. If you think that owning a car annually costs about $8,000, a shared mobility vehicle to take you around where you need to go at that same time, knowing that our cars stay idle for 90% of the time, using shared mobility for that 10%, 15% of time can cost us around $2,000. So you can see that there's huge savings here, up to $6,000 in not buying our cars, but looking at a circular solution instead. So shared mobility, for example, or mobility as a service. And we can also recycle our water and generate and store our energy, which can save on our utility costs. And it gives us independence and resilience. And of course, we're seeing that at the moment as people get more solar panels and batteries to be self-sufficient at home and in precincts. We can recycle our waste. We can separate our organics and create homegrown fertilizer. We can reduce carbon emissions in landfill by getting organic waste out of there. And we can even share our clothes, get a subscription for 4 or 20 garments, whatever we need, or an unlimited amount, instead of those capital investments up front for that product that makes its way pretty quickly to landfill. I mean, with fashion, we replace our wardrobe annually on average. So there's big opportunities here for us to start accessing and using circular as a service models. And if we now look at circular infrastructure, the digital transformation is really giving rise to so many new technologies, as you'd be aware, that are disrupting infrastructure and service markets and business as usual, these linear systems. And new technologies are converging our utility sector. For example, water and waste is energy, and mobility comes from solar. Can come from solar. So utility infrastructure is also getting smaller and more deployable. Solar panels and batteries at the home level. New water recycling technologies like the one on the screen now. It's the size of a fridge. It can recycle 85% of the wastewater in the home. And so in the same way that people have been rushing out to make their homes energy efficient, technologies like this one will make it possible for skinnier water connections and reduce demand and open the possibility for water self-sufficiency, and ultimately make it cheaper for consumers. And the same is true for waste. You know, countries, including Ireland, have specialist waste collection services where resource trucks are geared for more than 10 different waste streams, and they go from home to home, picking up with care and precision the different waste streams, avoiding and checking for contamination. As we know, clean waste streams are key for extracting the maximum value out of resources. We've also seen Infrastructure Australia for the first time add waste infrastructure to its priority infrastructure list, and to recognise the role of circular economy. Sorry, still on that previous slide, Laura's helping me with the slides, everyone. So for the first time ever, Infrastructure Australia has added waste to its priority infrastructure list, and it's recognising the role of circular economy in forever changing the infrastructure and services that we use today. It's recognising that they're getting smaller and more deployable, and that means that the role of consumers is also changing. We're not just consuming, we're also producing and consuming and becoming prosumers. So this has a lot of ramifications on how we actually ensure that prosumers are getting the benefits and enabled to get the benefits of a circular economy, of getting free energy from the sun, using what they need, sharing or selling any excess, and the same with water. So if we're setting ourselves up to extract value from resources, then we need infrastructure that lets us do that. And two-way energy grids to trade and generate renewable energy, two-way water grids to trade and generate sustainable water and keep it locally for greening and to improve amenity. And then also integrated local transport hubs where we can affordably and safely and conveniently access shared mobility and options like scooters and bikes, cars, vans, trucks, and just avoid the capital costs of that larger heavy infrastructure. And this also is enabling us to rethink big infrastructure and default linear systems like desalination plants, dams, gas, and roads infrastructure. And circular economy is really giving us options to be way more efficient in the infrastructure we invest in and deploy. I want to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals now on the next slide. And circular economy is really the best economic framework to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. If we look at the Sustainable Development Goals here, the circular economy is the only economic framework that can tackle the climate consumption and biodiversity crises. It's helping us preserve and recycle water to tackle SDG 6, generate local renewable energy, number 7, drive economic growth and decent work, number 8, and 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure, and 11, to create more sustainable cities and communities. It's also enabling 12, responsible consumption and production, and of course 13, tackling climate change. And I think we can also argue that 14 and 15 are obviously, 14 and 15 are obviously included in outcomes by the circular economy, which is enabling and improving life below water and on land. But I think we can also argue that it goes to SDG 1 and 2. If we can create regenerative systems, we can also tackle no poverty and zero hunger, and also 10, reduce inequality. So you can see circular economy has a huge role to play here in tackling the SDG goals. And I think this is a really important discussion for us to be thinking about. So this SDG goals should and need to be at the forefront of our policy work, our research work, and our objectives as organisations, but also as governments and countries around the world. Then the other key area on the next slide is circular economy and zero carbon. And I want to talk about the intrinsic link between circular economy and zero carbon. The current response to the global climate crisis represents an incomplete picture, and leading think tanks, including Ellen MacArthur Foundation, have been really successfully demonstrating why putting in place the circular economy is fundamental to achieving our climate targets. And they're showing that we need to move more beyond just minimising emissions in our linear system. We need to embrace a circular economy that can both not just reduce the emissions, but also increase resilience. And the circular economy creates this framework to meet goals, including creating more livable cities and distributing value more widely in the economy and catalysing innovation. So these attributes that make circular economy a potent contributor to achieving zero carbon. And the greenhouse gas emissions causing climate change are a product of our take, make, waste extractive economy that continues to rely on fossil fuels and doesn't manage resources in the long term. So even if we meet our zero carbon emission targets by 2050 to meet the 1.5 degree target set out by the Paris Agreement, the cost to the global economy projected as a result of climate change are around the $54 trillion by 2100. And they're going to continue to rise steeply with every further temperature increase. So we really do need to go beyond renewables to tackle the colossal impacts of climate change to our economy and the way of life and our way of life in decades to come. Tackling renewables is crucial and it's totally consistent with a circular economy. And on that note, I just want to credit the New South Wales Minister for Energy Environment, the Honourable McLean, for his Australian leading work in establishing renewable energy zones and securing support through Parliament for these. But look, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation research, which has been undertaken with leading companies and governments around the world, shows that renewable energy measures can only address 55% of emissions. The remaining 45% comes from producing cars, clothes, food, and other products that we use every day. And we just can't overlook these. So the circular economy can contribute to completing the picture of emissions reduction by transforming the way we make and use products. There's a lot of challenges, and I want to talk about that now. This year has been seminal in demonstrating the significant challenges we face on our planet. And Laura, if you can just go to the next slide. And these challenges have come about because of our linear throwaway and flush-away economy. We're all much closer than our geographical boundaries and geopolitical boundaries, and COVID is a byproduct of climate change. It's spread silently and at great speed around the planet, and microplastics are ingrained in our environment, even in remote locations. The global wind systems blow chemicals from one side of the world to another, and we're all breathing the same air. We're all eating foods grown sometimes from the other side of the world. We're drinking water that's been recycled through the natural system. So respect for our natural systems will be rewarding, but they'll also be economically prosperous for all of us. And with a circular economy, it's not mutually exclusive. We really can grow our economy and respect and enhance our natural systems. Well, look, now I want to talk about New South Wales Circular and what we're doing to make all this happen. New South Wales Circular is one of 3 networks set up by the Office of Chief Scientist and Engineer, and we're lucky to be hosted by the University of New South Wales, and which has been undertaking world-leading work and research in circular economy. We're at our second business horizon, and we have a new vision, which I think you'll all support, which is a New South Wales circular economy that drives economic prosperity, jobs, sustainability, and zero carbon. And I want to talk now, in the next slide, that we're on a mission, and that is to fast track this zero carbon circular economy and unlock the $210 billion opportunity across Australia that I mentioned before, to drive jobs and productivity and lead a sustainable recovery for Australia's largest state. And it is a $1 trillion opportunity in Europe and Asia, and I think we're just beginning to unpack the benefits to the Australian economy and the New South Wales economy here. We have new objectives. If you go to the next slide, thanks Laura. We're heading, as I said, into our second business horizon, and we think that New South Wales and Australia it's our time for a resurgence as a global force. And we've got this bold ambition for Australia to be at the forefront of global transformation by galvanising business and government, researchers and citizens and yourselves to deliver this fundamental shift. Our objectives are to become a leading independent circular economy body, and we're excited to be able to be a sandpit to try and test circular programs and initiatives. We're also looking at how we can catalyse new circular economy investment and job opportunities, and we've got some fantastic partnerships here with the special activation precincts across New South Wales and other leading organisations around the plastics plan, with the Planet Arc Australian-wide circular marketplace. We have a partnership with them. We're also looking at how we can remove barriers to the circular economy, and we have a number of task forces with significant brains trust on those task forces that are helping us do that. And then we're also looking at how we can empower and promote circular behavioural change. Our key areas are 3 areas. One is data, and I'd urge you all to look at our strategic plan, which is on our website. The data, which includes all of this information, data, we're looking at how can we actually create a knowledge bank of information that's transparent and accessible around the value of materials, for example. What's the value of a solar panel in terms of the silicon and silver and other things in it that are valuable and the market can see an opportunity to invest in. We've set up, leading the charge for our data work is our amazing Dr. Mei Tang, who's Australia's first Chief Circular Economist. And she's leading our work around benchmarking and how we can actually put some transparent and accountable systems in place for people to understand how much we're recycling. The second really core area we're working in, it's gritty, it's tough, and we have Professor Dianne Wiley, who's assisting us here in other universities on how we can actually kickstart some supply chains. So we're looking at textiles, we're looking at plastics, and we're looking at solar panels in the first instance as new circular supply chains that we can kickstart. And we're working with hospitals and some fantastic participants to get that going. The final area is collaboration. How can we work with you to really drive the circular economy? And I think that's a good way to end. I think I've taken up enough time, and I'd love to hear some questions from all of you. So thank you, Dianne.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lisa, for your great presentation. Does anyone have a question? Lisa's probably got time for one question before I know she has to duck off. No, I don't see anything coming up. But Lisa, what's the best way for people on this conference to get involved?
Well, they should definitely reach out to us, and they can do that at contact@newsouthwalescircular.org, and we can send around some information there. We're looking for partners with supply chains. The supply chain alliances work that we're doing involves partners coming on, signing up to it. We're looking at who can be circular suppliers, who's got waste streams that they want to put back into a circular solution, who can work on the processing or remanufacturing of advanced manufacturing of those products, who can buy the end results, the end products that are being produced and join our supply chain in that way. So I think that's a fantastic way for organisations and participants to get involved. So we're really keen to hear from people around that area if they're interested.
Yes, thanks, Lisa. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. One of the challenges I think we've seen in the last few decades is how do we get those markets, those infrastructure and services going? And I think that's where, you know, we really do need that coming from government or a group like New South Wales Circular. So there's one more question if you've got time. What do you see as a circular economy opportunity for regional areas?
Look, I think it's the thing about the circular economy is the regions and the cities equally have a huge amount to contribute, and I think the regional areas have a significant role to play. And New South Wales Circular is working at the moment, as I mentioned, with the special activation precincts which run across regional New South Wales, and we're looking at how we can create circular economy hubs. So I'd be urging anyone in regional areas to get in touch with us. They can also work through their joint organisations to partner with us. We're very keen to kickstart programs, and particularly I think the SAP regional development work that's being done here is a really good platform to start.
Okay, well, thanks, Lisa. I think I should let you go so that you're not late for your next meeting. But thank you very much for giving us that wonderful overview and also of New South Wales Circular role in this. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Mei Tang, who, as has been mentioned a couple of times already, is Australia's first Chief Circular Economist with New South Wales Circular. Dr. Tang holds a Bachelor of Commerce from Melbourne University, a Master's in Applied Statistics from ANU, and a PhD in Economics from the University of Sydney. She says in her bio that she considers herself as an economist and policy specialist, and she has more than 25 years experience across both the public and private sector. She was previously Executive Director of Circular Economy with the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, and also the New South Wales Environment Protection Authority, and Director of Economic Policy with the New South Wales Department of Premier and Cabinet. Prior to that, she was the Head of Policy and Research with the Australian Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. She worked in technology and commercialisation through roles in SMARTS, which is now a division of NASDAQ OMX, the Capital Markets Cooperative Research Centre, and she consulted for corporate, NGO and government clients. So I think you'll agree she's well placed to be the first Chief Circular Economist in Australia, and she's going to talk to us today, provide a summary and overview of the recent report on the circular economy opportunity in New South Wales. So over to you, Mei.
Thanks, Diane, and thanks also to Lisa, although I think she's off the line, for setting us up really nicely with that overview of the CE space here in Australia and overseas. It's been really exciting to see how the concept of the circular economy has been mainstreamed over the recent years in particular, but I think we all agree that there's a lot more to be done still here in Australia and in New South Wales in particular. So with that in mind, New South Wales Circular recently put out a report on the circular economy opportunity in New South Wales. I think we've talked a lot about the opportunity, and there are a lot of bits of information floating out there, but I think it was useful for us to be able to bring them all into one space so that we can actually look at it in its entirety. And if we wanted to look at the opportunity in New South Wales and Australia, we need to, first of all, I think, look at where we're coming from and what's the sort of extent of the untapped opportunity. So let's see whether we can move this. Here we go. So let's look at some stats for Australia as an example. We extract and use a lot of primary resources. We all know that we are an extraction type of economy, but this sort of puts it in pretty stark context. We extract and use around 38 tons of primary resources per capita each year, and that's more than double the OECD benchmark. As a country, we are the largest material user per capita in the region and the second largest in the OECD after Chile. We also have the second highest material footprint per capita in the OECD after Luxembourg. And unfortunately, we don't do enough with the resources that we're using. We've got the third lowest material productivity in the OECD after Chile and Estonia. We generate only $1.28 worth of economic output for every kilogram of materials that we consume. This is less than half the OECD benchmark of $2.90, and it's also significantly less than the rates of around $5 to $6 per kilogram for countries like the UK, Netherlands, and Switzerland. On top of that, we know that manufacturing only makes up a really small percentage of our overall economy, around 6% of GDP. And we've got the lowest manufacturing self-sufficiency in the OECD as well. So in other words, we only produce around 2/3 as much manufactured output as we consume. And on top of all that, we're also producing a lot of waste, and that waste is not necessarily being recirculated back into the economy. So this slide shows us a state-by-state breakdown of where our waste goes. The red areas show us the amounts that are going into disposal or landfill. The dark brown area shows us the amounts that are being recovered through energy recovery, but in all honesty, most of that is being done through gas capture at landfills. And the green areas show us the amounts that are being recycled with the dotted green lines, the recycling rates. And you can see there that we actually haven't moved really far as a country over the years, and New South Wales in particular. Australians produce around 540 kilograms of municipal solid waste per capita per annum. That's around 9% more than comparable nations. And we still landfill as a country around 20 million metric tons of our core waste each year. That's around 30 to 40% of our total waste generation. If you compare this to countries like the UK, which are around 23% going into landfill, and countries like the Netherlands, which is actually quite a small percentage, around 2 to 3% going to landfill, we've got quite a long way to go. If we continue on our current waste generation path, we'll have enough waste to fill Sydney Harbour in just 14 years. And you can see that New South Wales resource recovery rate, which is the dotted line, we've plateaued at around 65% in recent years. This is low compared to other states with waste levies, such as South Australia, which is around the 80% mark, and Victoria, which is around the 70% mark. The only other waste levying state with a lower recovery rate is Western Australia, which is around 50 to 60%, but they also have a much lower waste levy than we do here in New South Wales as well. So that's food for thought. So where does this leave us if we don't move towards a circular economy? We know that we'll only get halfway to net zero emissions by 2050, and Lisa's talked about that in some detail. This is true for New South Wales as well as for the broader economy, which was from the Ellen MacArthur stats that she cited earlier. We know that here in this state, only half of all emissions come from stationary energy generation. The rest of it, or large chunks of it, comes from the transport sector, from agriculture and industry. So we need to tackle all of that if we're going to reach the state's goal of net zero emissions by 2050. And second, if we don't move towards a circular economy, our long-term water security remains under pressure, and this is particularly the case in urban water systems. Shortages of fresh water will require us to build more circular water systems. In New South Wales, only around 44,000 million litres of recycled water is produced annually. This is less than 7% of our total water supply. And we know that wastewater discharge into our waterways is one of the main causes of deterioration of coastal water quality as well. So the more that we can do to recirculate and reduce our wastewater, the better it will be for our broader ecosystem. And thirdly, we know that our waste and the costs associated with managing that waste will continue to rise if we don't do something about it. In 2017-18, New South Wales households paid $1.3 billion in municipal waste charges. The average New South Wales household, and those of you who pay your waste rates will know this, pay around $390 in annual council waste charges. And some of you might be thinking, hang on, I pay a lot more than that, and you possibly will do that as well because the waste charges vary considerably from local council to local council. On average, though, these charges are estimated to reach $652 per household by 2035. So that's totaling $2.5 billion statewide. That's a lot of money. Circular economy initiatives where it involves the reduction of waste going to landfill and the recirculation of waste back into the productive economy can be part of the solution towards more cost-effective living in the long run for the average household. So finally, the upshot of it all is that we'll continue to lose valuable economic opportunities, which involve jobs growth, which involves economic growth if we continue to ignore the opportunities in the circular economy. And we want to unpack that a little bit more. What is the opportunity in reality? What happens if we were to, for example, have a modest 5% uplift in resource recovery rates? Modeling by the Centre for International Economics has shown that this could contribute up to $1 billion to Australia's GDP and up to $644 million to New South Wales GSP as well. And importantly, it will also generate increase in household consumption and a 0.12% increase in the real wage rate, which has been stagnant for the last few years. So that's a projected benefit if there is a 5% uplift in resource recovery. So that's a diversion of resources from landfill. What happens if we look at, for example, a 5% uplift in materials efficiency? So in other words, if you can get 5% more output for the same amount of input, you would generate a $24 billion uplift to Australia's GDP and a $10 billion uplift to New South Wales GSP. And accompanying that would be a 2.7% increase in the real wage rate. So that would be pretty significant. And the reason for this broader based uplift is because materials efficiency affects the economy as a whole. So basically every industry can participate in that. Whereas if you're talking about just resource recovery, you're only looking at waste related activities. So that's a much smaller subset of overall economic activity. But regardless of that, in either case, New South Wales would actually benefit disproportionately more than other states in either 5% uplift scenario, because first of all, we have higher waste activity. And second, we have higher material use intensity. So what that means is that we actually generate more waste per unit of GSP than the average other states in Australia. So there's a real material benefit for us to think very deeply about how we can achieve even these modest uplifts, whether it's at the organizational level, whether it's at the household level, but what we would really like to see this happen is at the state level. So in the report that we produced, we narrowed down our focus on looking at the opportunity in key materials sectors, and we classified them into two categories. One we called high potential, and these are high volume waste materials with large environmental impacts, challenges in contamination and processing, which has made recycling to date quite challenging. And so it's been really, there's been a big gap from what we'd like to, where we'd like to be, and from realizing the full value of the material stream. And the materials that we looked at in this sector are, the clear candidate is plastics, obviously. New South Wales consumes over 1 million tons of plastics annually. This is a combination of both single-use plastic, short-life plastics, and also long-life plastics, which would be things like PVC piping and carpet underlay and things like that, which you don't expect to throw out every year. But what we do throw out every year is 800,000 tons of plastic waste each year, and we recycle less than 10% of this. There's also been an observed increase in plastic waste over this last year because of COVID. For very obvious reasons, we've seen an increase in the PPE, but also, you know, lots and lots of plastic packaging, whether it's for sterilization materials or not. And when you think about the eventual rollout of COVID vaccines around the world to a population of 7.8 billion people, not including booster shots, not including annual vaccinations, you can think about the enormity and the scale of the challenge of dealing with the amount of plastic waste and how it makes absolute sense to have a plan for dealing with it before it's even rolled out. So creating a step change in how plastic is used and disposed can create significant value for New South Wales. For a ton of plastics, landfilling it in New South Wales can cost more than $200 in upfront costs alone. And more detailed modeling by the federal government has shown that for every ton of plastic recycled, that produces a net benefit of $29, which doesn't sound that much, but you compare it to the net disbenefit of negative $420 if it's landfilled, and that includes the cost of production, also the environmental cost of actually producing raw plastic from virgin material as well. You can see that there actually is material benefit both from an economic and environmental perspective from moving towards a circular economy for plastics. So we know that Australia's ability to process and recycle its plastic waste needs to grow by 400% due to the co-ed waste bans alone that are going to be rolled out over the coming few years. And this is not even considering the vast amount of plastic waste within the country that is not being sent overseas, but instead being sent to landfill. So we believe that there is an opportunity to grow Australia's domestic plastic manufacturing industry significantly. The second area that we looked at was textiles. This has historically been a problem area because there aren't a lot of commercial solutions for recycling textiles. And textile production, as most of you know, has a large environmental impact. It takes around 7,000 liters of water just to make a typical pair of jeans. And the industry accounts for around 1/5 of global wastewater. Australia is ranked second in the world for textile disposals, and households account for nearly 90% of all our textile waste. So there is a clear role for both producers and households to take responsibility for the textile waste that we're producing, and also we are invested in looking for better futures and better outcomes for textile waste. As a nation, we threw away some 300,000 tons of textiles annually, and around 90% of this was landfilled. And as we know, there aren't a lot of commercial solutions. Most of it, if it doesn't go into reuse, would either be shredded and used as rags or fill, or a very, very small percentage of that goes into chemical recycling. So at this disposal rate, the Metropolitan Sydney textile disposal could cost up to $8 million in waste levies alone every year. So we need to grow a circular textile industry to address this growing environmental and economic problem. Reusing old textiles is obviously the preferred option, but where this is not possible, we need to look at where we can invest in new recycling technologies and ways and market models of rolling this out commercially. And finally, the last high potential area that we looked at was in organics. And this is a clear winner because we know that this is a major emitter of, is a major source of emissions as far as our waste profile is concerned. Organic waste produces about 2.4% of Australia's total greenhouse gas emissions. And it accounts for the majority of our waste emissions as well. A large proportion of the waste in landfills across Australia is comprised of organics. There are around 80 organics processing facilities in New South Wales, but many of these are reported to be near their processing capacity and with healthy annual demand as well. The organics recycling industry itself has estimated that if we can increase our organics recovery rate nationally to around 90%, this could generate an extra $500 million in industry value add, as well as over 3,000 extra jobs, in addition to obviously the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to look more seriously about how we can do this better. And I think the work of the EPA through their food hate waste programs and organics recovery programs have gone a long way towards helping us get on this path. But again, we need to do more, and we need to also think about the amount of waste that we are throwing away. I think there was recent research by Rabobank that showed the average household throws away around 13% of their weekly shop. So that's quite a surprise to me, because in these budget constrained times, I think we would be all a lot more conscious about the stuff that we are consuming and throwing away. But the stats don't lie. So I think there is an element of behavior and cultural change that's involved, required for this as well. And finally, we look at future stars. These are a category of complex but high value-based products with strong growth projections and very limited recycling options at the moment. So at the moment, they mostly end up in landfill. And there's opportunities that we see for greater innovation and investment in the design and recycling, so that we can realize the significant value from these products. The clear candidate for this is just a broad category of e-waste. We know that e-waste is growing at 3 times the rate of general waste in Australia, and we can only expect this to increase. And Australians, unfortunately, are among the largest generators per capita of e-waste in the world. We generate over 500,000 tons per annum, or 22 kilos per capita, and this is among the highest in OECD countries. And the shame of it is that we know that there's a lot of valuable materials, particularly rare metals, embedded in their components. Mobile phones, for example, have components made of gold, of silver, rare earth metals, etc. And these would have significant value if we can extract them easily. We know that 41 mobile phones can yield significant value, as much gold as 1 ton of gold ore, and 550,000 handsets can remove the need to mine 330 tons of precious metal ore. Next, we look at a subset of e-waste, which is lithium-ion batteries. These are just prolific throughout the economy at the moment, because we just need to have, more, better, bigger energy storage systems. Research has shown that Australia could potentially recover up to $800 million to $3 billion from lithium-ion battery recycling by 2036, if we were to embark down this path. At the moment, though, we know that we discard around 3,000 tons of LIB waste, and only 2% of this is collected and exported, mostly for offshore recycling. So this is obviously an opportunity for us to do better. And the final material or product category that we looked at was solar PV systems. Again, this is an area which has been identified by the government as a priority area for attention, because while there hasn't been a lot of solar panel or solar system recycling in the past, these systems typically last between 10 to 30 years. There is going to be a looming pipeline of rooftop solar systems in particular that are going to be nearing their end of life over the coming decade and decades to come. Currently, Australia has the highest household uptake of solar globally. Over 1/5 of homes have rooftop PV systems. And as of June 2020, there were nearly 2.5 million solar PV systems installed across Australia. It's estimated by 2035, around 100,000 tons of PV panels Australia-wide will need to be recycled or otherwise disposed in landfill. The IRENA, or International Renewable Energy Agency, has looked at the global value of materials that could potentially be recovered from solar panels, and they think that by 2050 this would amount to around $15 billion. And the valuable materials in solar panels include things like silicon, copper, and silver, and there's a massive benefit for us to be able to recycle them rather than to have to extract them from the ground. So that's a snapshot of some of the key materials and potential circular economy pathways that we looked at. And in summary, just to give you a quick overview of what we've canvassed in the last half hour and in the report, we know that Australia is a big consumer of resources and materials, and we landfill or throw away a lot more of it than we really need to. So we really need to reduce our impacts on the environment and also improve the productivity of our resources, which just makes economic sense. New South Wales as a state, though, has a similar profile and only average poor recycling rates. And we have average to poor closed loop systems internally as well, although this is changing. We feel that New South Wales has the capacity to lead Australia in many essential elements of the circular economy. We have world-class research and innovation systems, material science and design systems, waste research, and market innovation that looks at how we can do better at the processing and advanced manufacturing of valuable materials from some of those streams that I've talked about. We also have a massive opportunity in the States, $107 billion infrastructure pipeline to roll out circular economy planning and thinking and materials as part of that planning and construction process. So the pilots and demonstration projects in both urban and regional industrial precincts and special activation precincts and communities are going to be really important test beds for us to roll out the circular economy within the state. They're also important test beds for us to actually gather data and start benchmarking how we're doing and how we can do better, because you can't actually measure success unless you can collect the data on it. And finally, the circular economy would be a really useful requirement in achieving the state's goal of net zero emissions by combining CE with a renewable strategy towards net zero. So with that, I have come to the end of the presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I'm really happy to take any questions.
So thank you so much, Mei, for that, what I will call startling, amazing and confronting presentation. We do have a couple of questions here. So first of all, the figures you mentioned, are they all available in the report?
I think they are, and I say I think because there has been new data released by the ABS in their experimental waste accounts recently, which came out after the report was released, but by and large, yes, the figures are available in the report.
And I guess there's more than that available as well, probably. Yeah, so we also have a couple of questions about some of the data. So in the recycling graphs, were those numbers at the point of collection or when the recycled materials are reused?
If you're talking about the recycling volumes, Yeah, those would be at the point of collection, yes. So the waste data doesn't actually track what happens to the volumes after they enter the remanufacturing process.
And also on a similar line, when you think about the states' waste charts, do you have percentage differences between the states for things like disposal, energy recovery, etc.?
Yes, I think some of those were reflected in the stats in terms of just the volumes of waste that were being used by energy recovery. And like I said, most of that is actually attributable to gas capture from landfills. There's hardly anything that's is derived from, made to order energy from waste facilities, although there are some facilities that are currently at the planning and development stage already, so we'd expect that to change in the near term, not so much in New South Wales, but in other states. But yeah, the stats are available if you wanted to break that down a little bit more.
Okay, and one perhaps final question. Is Australia's prominence on the international material usage per capita chart mainly a reflection of us being a large raw material exporter, say for example iron ore? Do we need to focus on materials we actually use within Australia or import and look to improve our poor performance on landfilling waste?
Yeah, so that materials use stats is a reflection of both our extraction as well as the materials that we import.
Okay, so look, thank you very much. I'm going to close off now because I think that we would like to encourage all of our participants to perhaps join the next session, which I think is also being run by New South Wales Circular. And if you haven't had a look in the chat feature, there are certainly a couple of other sessions that might be useful if you haven't already registered for them. So this afternoon there's another session on textiles and the circular economy, and then on Thursday there's one on food waste as well, but there's also a lot of other great sessions coming on. And Kame, I really want to thank you for that presentation. I think for me, those people who on this presentation know me, you know my love of Sydney Harbour and events there and sailing there, so the fact that it could be filled in 14 years with our waste is pretty confronting and also amazing, and I think it really does just give at least me a real sense of the scale of the problem that we're trying to deal with, and also I think just how you were able to highlight where some of the great opportunities are, and I'm sure that's just a few of the great opportunities as you've pointed out. So thank you very much, Kame, and to all our participants, please do go and join one of the other sessions because I'm sure you will find lots of great information about the circular economy, lots of great opportunities over the coming week.